So I'm Lisa from ProWritingAid, and my guest today is Micah McGuire, and she is a writer and a self-professed productivity geek. She is also the founder and the program strategist for the Mind Redesign. And I first met Micah when she became a regular contributor to the ProWritingAid blog last November. And when we started doing this series, she was one of the very first ones to stand up and offer to share her skills and experience with all of you. And so welcome, Micah. It's so nice to have you here.
Thanks, Lisa. I am excited to be here. It's been an honor to be part of such an awesome series of topics. These webinars have been fantastic so far.
Oh, great. That's so nice to hear. Well, good. I'm just going to hand it over to you and disappear in the background and learn along with everyone else. So yeah, over to you.
Okay, sounds great. All right, everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen and we will go ahead and get started. Okay. All right, everyone, is that all coming through for everyone before we get started?
Yep, I've got it. Looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we are all here today to discuss a little bit about how to beat a writing slump, right? And we are going to talk a bit about how there are brain science tips that we can use that can help pull us out of our slumps, both from a productivity level and from a creativity standpoint. So, this is a little bit about what we're going to be going over today. First of all, we're going to be talking about how we can schedule our writing sessions so that we are writing with our biology instead of against it. Then we're really going to get into the meat of this presentation, which I'm sure is what everybody's looking forward to, which is how we can get into these sessions of effortless focus. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how to quiet the inner critic, which interestingly enough is a huge component to point 2 on how we can focus effortlessly. All right, so let's dive in. Okay, so I'm sure all of you are wondering what on earth larks, night owls, and third birds could have anything to do with our writing sessions. And it actually turns out that these are the names for 3 different chronotypes. And what a chronotype is it is an indication of how your biology affects your circadian rhythms and your energy levels during the day. And this actually originally came from some research from Franz Hallberg back in the 1940s. He is basically considered the father of chronobiology, which is the study of how our internal clocks impact everything about us, from our energy levels during the day to now even they're looking into how our internal clocks affect our uptake of pharmaceutical drugs. So there's all of these different areas that have really been touched by chronobiology. And whenever the experts really started looking into this and exploring how people's energy levels and their sleep patterns were affected, they kind of looked into what types of patterns they were seeing, and they found out that we do have some folks who are true morning people, or the morning larks. We have some folks who are true night people, or the night owls. And then finally, the rest of us kind of fall in between those two, and we're not really true morning people, we're not really true evening people, so we're kind of called third birds. Now, a lot of the research I am going to discuss here is kind of summarized in Daniel Pink's book, When. He also has a fantastic article on the Wall Street Journal that is called How to Be Happier, Healthier, and More Productive, that really dives into a lot of this research, and we'll hopefully have that link for you in the chat. But he talks about whenever they started looking at the energy patterns of people, they found out that everyone has an energy pattern of having a peak energy level, a trough period where their energy levels really, really dip down, and then finally a recovery period in which the energy levels kind of come back just a little bit. And the interesting thing is when they looked at larks, when they looked at owls, and they looked at third birds, they found out that we're not quite all marching to the same drum. So this is a bit of what an energy level diagram looks like for a lark and a third bird. So you can see here from the time you wake up in the morning to the peak time around about 11 a.m. to about 12 p.m. That is your peak time. So that is when the energy levels for a lark or a third bird is rising during the day. And then we have this precipitous drop during the afternoon, and I think we're all familiar with that afternoon slump, right? And this trough period is true for everyone, so no one can really get out of this, unfortunately. But then you'll see after that really sharp dip, we kind of have energy levels kind of leveling off, and that is the recovery period. Well, what's interesting about all this is if you look at the way that people's tasks correlate to these energy periods, you are generally going to be more analytical and a little bit more logical during your peak period. So for these larks and these third birds, a lot of logical and really intensely focused tasks are best scheduled in the morning. Whereas with the recovery period, you're going to be more creative. Your brain is a little bit groggy, and we've really discovered that that is a basically really good trigger for creativity. So creative tasks, we want to try to schedule more with a recovery period, right? And unfortunately, the trough, we just kind of have to get through in any one given day. There's not a certain type of work that's really suited for your trough time. Now, you would think that night owls would go through kind of a similar pattern, right? But actually, very interestingly, we found out that night owls are the opposite. So night owls actually have their recovery period during the morning. Like the larks and the third birds, they again have this energy slump during the afternoon. But as the evening wears on, a night owl actually starts into their peak energy levels. So they're becoming more alert, they're better at focusing, they're more analytical and more logical in the evening. Now, I know a lot of you are wondering, okay, well, what on earth does any of this have to do with my writing? Well, it turns out that we can use these peak and recovery periods to our advantage when it comes to scheduling our writing. So if you are trying to work on a scene that is very, very, very well laid out, or let's say you're a nonfiction writer and you're trying to work on a very analytical scene that has a lot of research involved, and you have to really stay intensely focused on that scene, then that is a good option to work on during your peak energy period. Larks and third birds, remember that that is going to be during your morning period, and night owls, remember that's going to be during your evenings. The great thing about all of this is we can also talk about if you are unsure where you kind of fall on that night owl, third bird, or lark scale, take a look at whenever you go to sleep in the evenings versus when you wake up in the mornings, and you're going to want to look at your sleep midpoint. And this is a case of if you had the day all to yourself, so you're not having to be concerned about work or anything like that. You don't feel like you have to wake up with an alarm clock. It's just if you're left to your own devices. So let's say if you go to sleep at midnight and then wake up at 8 a.m., your midpoint is going to be at 4 a.m. And that means that you are going to fall into the third bird category, because for these midpoints, larks generally fall in 12 to 3 a.m. for their midpoint. Third birds fall between 3 and 6 a.m. for their midpoints. And night owls, you fall in strictly after 6 a.m. is going to be your your midpoint period. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, where is my peak and where is my recovery period, kind of use those as your guide for scheduling these sessions. Now, talking about recovery, we mentioned that it is a little bit more of a creative period. So this is a time to work on scenes that you're really stuck on. So those scenes that we kind of have writer's block on and you just can't seem to get it right. It's really good to try to schedule those work sessions during your recovery period, because you're going to make better connections and you're eventually going to have a point that you say, okay, well, I can finally, kind of break through this block, simply because your brain is basically making more out-of-the-box connections than it would be during your analytical period. This is also a good time to do world building, character development, anything that requires less focus and more of an out-of-the-box mindset. So remember, for our larks and our third birds, your recovery period is going to be in the evening. Night owls, you guys are the opposite. You're going to have your recovery period during the mornings. Okay, so now that we kind of know that our biology is not interfering with our writing sessions and we have things kind of scheduled for optimal focus depending on what we're trying to work on, let's talk a little bit about how we can focus without any effort. And this is going to get into a little bit about a topic called flow. And flow is a psychological phenomenon that was really researched thoroughly by a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he was really the first psychologist to really dig into this and really codify a lot of what we know about flow. And Csikszentmihalyi was very interested in what makes people happy. So whenever he started looking into flow, he was referring to it as something that could boost people's happiness by being an optimal experience. So it is, in his sense, it is something that provides us a lot of happiness. It gives us a sense of purpose. It's a lot of joy. Well, the interesting thing about flow is that flow also increases our productivity. So if you look at a lot of the different research that's out there, the numbers can range from some studies, it is a 2x times in your productivity, to there was one study by McKinsey that was focusing on CEOs that said they were 5 times more productive when they were in flow than any other time. So it is a huge productivity boost. It is also a creative boost because there's some interesting neurochemistry that goes on when you actually enter this flow state. And if I haven't mentioned it already, I'm a huge neuroscience nerd, so this has always been a very interesting topic to me of how these neurotransmitters change depending on your brain state. But it turns out that flow enhances our creativity, which is actually a lot of what Csikszentmihalyi's original research focused on. Was he focused on a lot of athletes and he focused on a lot of creatives. So he noticed with the creatives that they all reported that it was much easier to work whenever they were in flow. So it is natural that as writers, we can really take advantage of this flow state. Now, Csikszentmihalyi did find out that there are some requirements for flow that actually separate it from just a state of intense focus. So the first requirement was it is a state, of course, of intense focus, because unfortunately we can't have flow if we're constantly being interrupted and our brains are constantly jumping from topic to topic. The next is that we had to have an achievable goal with immediate feedback. So you can kind of see how this would work out with athletes, because if you have a tennis player, say, that's practicing their serves, they're going to know immediately when they make that serve whether the ball hit in the right place, whether it went where they intended, did it go with enough power. So all of that really rolls into having that immediate feedback. The third requirement is that there is a change in your perception of time. And the two most reported things with flow is you either have a slowing of time or you have this time dilation. So if you've ever had a case where you've sat down to write and you've gone, oh my gosh, I feel like I haven't been writing for more than about 5 minutes, but you glance up at the clock and you realize, oh my gosh, it's been an hour, it's been 2 hours. Then congratulations, you've hit flow state before, because that is kind of almost the litmus test for whether you're really in flow or not, is whether you've had this change in your perception of time. With a lot of athletes, with a lot of musicians, with anyone who is a performer, however, you do run into the kind of this slowing of time where everything sort of slows down around them when they're getting ready to perform. And that's another example of how perception can change during flow. The next requirement is a silencing of the inner critic. And Csikszentmihalyi actually refers to this as no concern for the self in his work. But if you dig into a lot of his, the way he's talking about this, it really comes down to that inner critic going quiet. And I think that's something that we can really, really grasp well as creatives, is understanding having that critical voice finally go quiet. The fifth requirement is going to be a deep, effortless immersion. So what we mean by that is if you've ever had an administrative task that maybe it's fairly repetitive, but it's something that you really feel like, hey, I just need to kind of, bulldoze through it and get it done, then you'll notice that whenever you're doing the task, you're having to make an effort to keep your focus on task, right? Well, in the case of flow, you don't have to keep yourself on task. It's just this automatic autopilot that you're staying focused on the task without even thinking about it. And that's what we mean by that immersion. The sixth requirement is going to be a sense of control. So because we have this achievable goal in front of us, we do have this sense of control of, hey, you know, I can actually get there. And I think as writers, we're familiar with this in scenes that are, when we're writing and it's going very well and we're saying, hey, you know, I'm going to hit my goal for the day and do it on time. I think we're familiar with that sense of control. And then finally, the most important point is a balance between the skill level and the challenge. And let's see what I mean by that. So this chart refers to a little bit something called a flow channel. And you'll see here that on the y-axis, we have the level of challenge from low to high. And then on the x-axis, we have the level of your skills, again, from low to high. Here's the thing, is that if you have you're very, very skilled at something, but the level of challenge is very, very low, then you're going to end up bored. It's not going to be enough of a challenge. You're going to sit there and go, you know, I could do this with both hands tied behind my back. It's not going to be enough stimulation for you. But let's say that the level of challenge is very, very high, but the level of your skills is not that high. In that case, you're going to end up with anxiety because you're going to be looking at the task going, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. I don't know how to deal with this. I don't really know what I'm doing in these cases. And that's what the 2 points that we want to avoid. But somewhere in between those areas, we have this channel of flow wherein the challenge and your skills are matched. And if you look at the research that Csikszentmihalyi did, this was about a 4% challenge. Now, I know with a lot of athletes and things like that, that's going to make sense because you would sit there and say, okay, you know, if we're taking a marathon runner, 4% would be adding a little bit of extra mileage to their training routines. But as writers, I feel like this is a little bit of a vague goal, but we're going to dig into just a minute how we can basically kind of fine tune that goal to make that 4% challenge make sense. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty of how we can get into flow and basically how we stay in flow, I do have some resources that if anyone is interested, they are welcome to check out. Starting with Angela Duckworth's Grit. Basically, if anyone has read Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art, he talks a lot about the resistance. He talks a lot about this inner critic. Well, Angela Duckworth's Grit is kind of almost the multi-purpose version of The War of Art. The War of Art tends to be very creatively focused. Angela Duckworth's Grit covers all sorts of domains. So she really talks about how to approach challenges and how to really have that mindset so you can power through a challenge and hit your goals. And it actually turns out she has a great section on flow because Csikszentmihalyi was a researcher in residence at her university whenever she was doing her graduate program. The next one I want to touch on is going to be Cal Newport's Deep Work, which is really less about flow and more about focus. So as we mentioned, one of the requirements for flow is that state of intense focus. And if you're somebody that is not used to focusing intensely, especially over an extended period of time, then I highly suggest looking into Deep Work because he lays out a beautiful system for how you can stay focused for any period of time, whether that's for staying focused for 15 minutes or staying focused for 90 minutes. And he really lays it out very, very clearly in that book. And then finally, I'd like to talk about Stephen Kotler's Get Into Your Creative Flow course on Creative Live. And if you have any interest in what we're talking about here with flow, I cannot recommend taking his class enough. It is absolutely mind-blowing. And if you're also a neuroscience nerd like I am, he gets into this great stuff about the exact neurotransmitters that go into flow and all of that wonderful stuff. But even if you're not a big science person, he has a lot of actionable resources for creatives specifically on how you can get into flow, how you can stay into flow. And it covers just so much more than we can get covered in a, short lecture like this. So if you have any interest in this topic, I do recommend taking a look at that course. Now, let's dive into the nitty gritty of how we can get into flow. So there are 3 kind of main points that we need to have in place when we're trying to get a flow session set up. And the first point is that we need to set aside the time, and we need to set aside enough time. So Stephen Kotler recommends about 90 to 120 minutes, which I really agree with, because you'll come to find out that when you're trying to get into flow, there's going to be about a 15 to 45 minute period before you actually hit flow. And the timing is all going to do, that kind of differs for everyone, and we'll get into that in just a bit. But we want to make sure that we haven't set the time so short that, let's say you hit flow at 45 minutes, but you've only scheduled yourself for an hour. Well, your brain is all of a sudden going to go into panic mode, and it's going to go, well, I've only got 15 minutes left, and I really need to push myself to get this done. And you're going to have this background chattering going on that eventually is going to pull you out of flow no matter how hard you try to stay in it. So we want to make sure that we've got enough time that we're not feeling pressured once we hit that flow state. The next point is to aim for a comfortable challenge. So this goes back to that 4% rule that Csikszentmihalyi had kind of studied. And for writers, this is a little bit of a tricky measure, because if you look at points 2 and 3, writers essentially are terrible goal setters, because we have a tendency to set our goals in word counts. Well, if you look in the world of business, business talks about goal setting by lead measures, which are measures that you have direct control over, versus setting goals by lag measures, which are measures you don't have direct control over. Well, it turns out, unfortunately for us, the number of words we write in any one given session is a lag measure. We do not have direct control over the number of words we write in a session. Otherwise, we would be able to hit the same number of words every time we sit down to write. And if you look at any kind of business goal setting, they'll say, make sure you never set anything by a lag measure. But for a writer, we kind of get stuck in this place of what else are we going to set things by? So one of the things you might want to look into is the amount of time you're spending focused, or the amount of time you're spending writing. So instead of saying, oh, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write X number of words, consider your challenge of, okay, I usually, can stay focused for about 45 minutes. Instead of aiming for 45 minutes for this session, I'm going to aim for 50 minutes of focus. And that's really going to start setting those achievable, comfortable challenges if we kind of keep that 4% rule in mind. Now, if that is our challenge level, and our challenge level is more the time spent, then what on earth is our goal actually going to be, right? And this is the part that a lot of writers forget, is that when we sit down to write, we really need to have something in front of us that is a concrete, I'm going to work on this scene, or I'm going to work on getting this section done or this chapter done. And that's really the way you need to think of your writing goals, is setting out, I'm going to get this scene done or something like that. But here's the thing that we kind of have a tendency to forget, is that not all goals are going to directly just be writing goals. Sometimes we have cases that we run into a plot hole, right? And there's not a way that we can necessarily just write ourselves out of this plot hole. We actually have to sit down and think carefully about, okay, what are the different ways that I could possibly, work with this to fill this plot hole in and make it to where it's not either hindering the plot or basically being is maybe even an integral part of the plot that actually helps make things a deeper connection. And those are not just writing goals, those are more thinking goals. So whenever you sit down for a session, do kind of take that into account, that sometimes you may have goals that are a lot more thinking than they are writing. You may not have that many words on the page, but if you have solved the issue that you sat down to work on, then that you've achieved your goal. Other thing to keep in mind with your goal setting is, if you look on Kickstarter campaigns always have their goal and then they have a stretch goal. So if they reach a certain amount of funding, it unlocks more and more things that group's able to do. Think of your goal setting for your writing in the same way, in that you're going to sit down with a basic goal, but hey, if you hit that goal, let's say you're 5 minutes into flow, and all of a sudden the fill-in for that plot hole hits you like a ton of bricks, then hey, instead of wasting that extra flow time that you have available, you want to basically have another goal that you can go, okay, great, I've got the plot hole solved. Let me move on to this point next. Now, all of this may sound a little bit like magic, right? And it may sound like, okay, every time I sit down, I should be able to get into flow without a problem. But it turns out that there is one little problem with flow, and that is your inner critic. And the issue we run into here is that whenever we're trying to get into flow, we have this inner critic yammering away in our head. But remember, one of the requirements for flow is that silencing of the inner critic. Then what's interesting about this is that it does not matter how long a writer has been writing. It does not matter how many times they've been published, how successful they are. They still deal with this inner critic. I am a big fantasy writer myself, and I remember seeing on one of Neil Gaiman's social media accounts that he was having an issue with his flow, with basically his inner critic, and dealing with he was talking to a young writer who was talking about imposter syndrome. And he admitted that he had problems as well. So this is all stuff that we have to work through, even when we're successful and published. But I think the difference lies in a successful author is able to kind of cope with the inner critic. So there are some things that we can do to help with that. And the first step is acknowledging the critic. The next step is ignoring the critic. And then finally, if none of those work, then we're going to try to challenge the critic. First, in acknowledging the critic, we have to realize that this is going to happen to us regardless. So we talked about those first 15 to 45 minutes that we would deal with that critic for flow. Just accept it as being part of it. You know, Srinivas, who is author of Audience of One, basically talks about he writes 1,000 words a day and he still deals with having to deal with the inner critic for 45 minutes. So a lot of times if we can just accept that's happening, then we're able to continue moving forward. If the acknowledgement doesn't work, then we need to try to act like the piano player in this scene and try to ignore the critic. And if you're familiar with meditation, this comes down to a lot of meditation principles of letting the thoughts kind of flow past you without getting a lot of emotion attached to it. You know, sometimes it helps to do visualizations of imagining your inner critic is a voice on the radio and you're turning the volume on the radio down. And then if the ignoring the critic is not getting us anywhere, then we need to move to questioning the critic. Because the great thing about the inner critic is that their logic is very, very shaky. So if you start questioning them, then that logic is going to collapse. So let's say you're working on a first draft scene and your inner critic is saying, this is terrible, it's never going to work, it's horrible. You know, ask them, okay, does it have to be perfect on this run? And your inner critics might come back with something like, well, I mean, of course it has to be good. You know, we need to make sure we have a good first draft in place. Then you might ask, why do we need to do that? Am I sending this off to an agent tomorrow that I have to have it perfect? And gradually, as you begin questioning that logic, those thoughts will start to break down and your inner critic won't be able to come up with enough evidence to kind of support the points that it's bringing up, and you'll find that the inner critic will get quieter and quieter. You'll probably never silence the inner critic completely, but the more you get into practice of questioning the critic, the easier it does get and the faster you will learn to kind of quiet that down. Now, finally, the last thing I do want to touch on is coming out of flow. Just immediately before you stop your session, remember we've got that 90 to 120 minute session, you do want to stop while you're ahead. Leave off in a spot that you're excited to get to work again. So if you're in the middle of a scene and you're really enjoying it, leave off halfway through the scene. And this kind of meshes with Hemingway's advice to never start with a blank page. Always leave off in the middle of a sentence or the middle of a scene so that you have a foundation to come back on. After your session, you want to kind of seek out a relaxing or low stimulation activity to allow your subconscious mind to continue working on the problem. And Kotler talks about these as release activities because you're getting just enough stimulation for your subconscious mind to work on the problem. And ultimately what we're trying to do is basically have a shower moment, you know, where you have all of your best ideas come to you in the shower and all of a sudden the plot hole solutions and everything else pop in your head whenever you jump in the shower. That's what we're aiming for here. Kotler says that one of the best things to do is low-grade physical activity like walking, but anything that's going to be a little bit of mental engagement like reading, things like that is fair game as well. Then finally, between your flow session, you also want to find other activities that are not writing associated that can help you achieve flow. So this can be anything from crafting to playing instruments to cooking and baking, things like video gaming. There are some flow experts that argue against it, but if you look at Jane McGonigal's work, she says that gaming provides us with an achievable goal and the feedback of leveling up that basically lets us have an urgent optimism that we can achieve our goals. So that's starting to sound a lot like flow, right? Another point is to try to immerse yourself in creative environments as well. And those can be a huge help in starting to get you into these flow states because you're surrounding yourself with other people that are also in your flow states. Ultimately, remember that the more you are able to get into flow, the easier it's going to be to get into flow just in all of your writing sessions. So the more practice you get, the easier it does get and the faster you will get at it. Ultimately, I do want to leave everyone just with this quote from Franz Kafka. This is really kind of my summation on productivity. We really don't want to be doing this just to produce more widgets and get more things done. Why we want to be more productive is actually because we want to be able to do things that we enjoy and do the things we love. So that's really where we need to look at with writing productivity. We want to be able to do more of the things we love. And finally, if anyone would like to get into contact with me, there is all of my contact information. We will have those also, I'm sure, sent out in the chat as well. And we can get on with the Q&A.
Great. That was so interesting. You can leave that up if you want, in case people want to chat about it. Leave it up for a couple of minutes. Your last slide, just because it has your details there so people can grab them. A lot of this stuff is really new for me, but you know, when you hear something new and you think, oh, that's it. Oh, that's it. So much of it was so familiar. I feel like when I'm at work all day, I'm sort of sliding between that anxiety and that boredom all day, depending on the different activities that I'm doing and what I need to get done.
Definitely, and that's a thing that I think a lot of people run into whenever they're dealing with trying to get into these flow states. So let's see if we can pop this up. There we go, there's that slide.
There, we'll just leave that there so everybody can grab it before it disappears. So that was great. So everyone feel free to add your questions there and we'll go through them. But as I was listening to you, the thing that most jumped into my mind is that one thing that I struggle with is that if I have a task that I know I need to get done, if I give myself 2 hours to do it, I'll be my most productive in the last 20 minutes. But if I give myself 40 minutes to do it, I'll still be my most productive in the last 20 minutes. Is that a thing that people, as they're getting closer and closer to the deadline, become more productive?
Well, and that's something that I think is kind of dependent on the task that you're working with, because I think flow really is not suited to like a lot of very administrative tasks and things like that. So there are a lot of things that we talk about that require this really intense focus, right? But they may not have the other requirements of flow that really allow us to get into that flow state. So let's say that you're working on getting materials together for a campaign or something like that. You may be very, very intensely focused and you may have that boost of productivity, you know, kind of towards the end of your session simply because you do have the pressure of the session ending. But if you're not necessarily quite in that flow state with that task, that may be more the reason. With flow, in theory, you should be just as productive at the beginning of entering flow state, because of course we have that 15 to 45 minute, you know, kind of struggle in order to actually get into flow, right? Yeah. But once you're into that flow state, theoretically, you should be just as productive at the beginning as you should be at the end. So it kind of really depends on the task at hand. You have to make sure that your task is going to be suited to being something that's in flow. So I think a lot of writing and a lot of creative tasks are very, very well suited to flow. Whereas if you're trying to do marketing for your book campaigns, if you're independently published, if you're trying to do a lot of different tasks, maybe you're working on edits or things like that, that may be a little bit harder to get into that flow state and may be more suited to another productivity technique like the Pomodoro technique, where you take 25 minutes of intense focus and then a 5-minute break.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so a couple questions. The first one is, someone says, so for editing, do we aim at the peak phase because it's a left hemisphere task?
Yes, I would definitely say editing tends to be a lot more technical. Now, I do realize that there's different levels of editing. And if you're working on, say, a content edit, and let's say that you have a scene that you have just, it's kind of been the bane of your existence from the very beginning, and you're trying to find out a way to really give it that spark, that might be a time to do your content editing more at your recovery time. But if we're talking about a true line by line, very, very specific, concentrated kind of line edit, then definitely peak is your best time to do it.
Okay, great. Rohit says he feels lethargic throughout the day and his mind is blocked. And do you have any suggestions on how he can avoid that?
Well, I would first make sure kind of that you are, first of all, getting enough sleep, because that is the one that a lot of people run into, is that we just have a tendency to be a sleep-deprived society. And our brains, unfortunately, cannot run as well if we are sleep-deprived. They've now done studies that they're saying that even just depriving yourself of an hour of sleep, so let's say getting 7 hours instead of your intended 8 hours, over time, that sleep debt can lead you to being just as sleep deprived as someone who hasn't slept for an entire night. So the first thing I would take a look at is looking at your sleeping patterns, things like that. Next thing would be, I would start keeping an energy log to see if you have any times of days that maybe, hey, I do feel a little bit better. Maybe you're sitting there going, well, in the morning it isn't as bad. I get to the afternoon, it's worse. So that would be another way of kind of analyzing the situation. And then the third, of course, would be looking into your health and making sure that everything is okay on the health side of things.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean about sleep. I sometimes feel, maybe it's me getting older, but sometimes if I don't get enough sleep one night, I feel the repercussions for 2, even 3 days before I finally get back.
And that exactly aligns with this new research that we've run into, because they're saying this sleep debt can have repercussions for days. I mean, they have actually discovered that the weekend, simply trying to catch up on your sleep on the weekend, is not necessarily enough. They still don't know exactly how long it takes to catch up on these debts.
Yeah. There's another question that's a bit related. Do you have suggestions for getting out of slumps? I used to have a really good habit previously, but now I'm feeling stuck all of a sudden. Sorry, I don't have a name for that.
First of all, I would make sure that you are kind of aligning the task with your biology. So like we talked about, don't try to do a lot of creative tasks during your peak period, because you're going to be more suited to doing a lot of more analytical tasks in those cases. Because you want to make sure, first of all, that you're not kind of banging your head against a brick wall. Because if we're already setting ourselves up at a time where we're not kind of attuned to being more focused, then that's going to make it that much more difficult. Once you kind of have that down, I would work on breaking it down into the smallest habit possible. So if that's sitting down simply to try to take a writing period of 15 minutes in the beginning, the most important thing is do something that's small enough that you can be consistent. A lot of these habit formation books talk about, if you're trying to build the habit of flossing, floss one tooth. You want to break it down into something that is that small that it's effortless for you to be consistent. And then once you've kind of built up that consistency, then you'll start to find that it gets easier and easier, and hopefully it will pull you more towards being more creative and pulling out of that slump.
Okay, great. Alexander has a really interesting question. He says, is there such a thing as having too many flow states? So for example, he is an amateur writer, musician, he's a writer and a musician in his spare time. Are there any specific strategies for chaining together your flow sessions?
Really, if you look at a lot of what Stephen Kotler has said with his research, he says there is no such thing as too much flow, because really he says, he talks about flow begetting more flow, that basically the more you're in this flow state, the more you will be able to pull yourself into this flow state. So really, I don't think there's such a thing as having too much flow, as long as you are kind of dealing with separate domains. I do think you can burn yourself out. Let's say you're a fiction writer and you're also a poet and you're also a songwriter. Well, all of those are very connected on the writing side. So I can see how having to work through those flow states constantly would start to burn you out, just not necessarily because you're getting in flow states, but just because it's a lot of effort on that same level and you're not able to make new connections, which is really the foundation of creativity, right? But if you're in these separate domains, like being a writer and also being a musician, then I think that's only going to be helpful for your creativity. As far as chaining them together, the only thing I would make sure of is I would make sure that you have some sort of break between your sessions. I don't know that it's necessarily a good idea to try for multiple sessions a day, because if you look into Cal Newport's deep work, he says that we actually really have a cap of about 4 hours of pure focus that we can do. And if you think about it, in any one given day, we're probably going to use up about an hour to 2 hours of that focus on other tasks, you know, things at work, just general life activities, things like that. So that really only leaves us with that 2-hour reservoir in which we can separate that out for kind of our creative work. So I would say try to stick to about one flow session a day, but alternating off between those days would make perfect sense.
Okay, great. Tanya was asking if there are any techniques that you can recommend to help before a flow session starts, to help get into it and make it happen more easily.
Yeah. So I think this kind of depends on how used to being intensely focused you are. And if you're somebody that is not used to focusing for long periods of time, my first suggestion would be building up your focus tolerance. So going through a lot of what Cal Newport talks about in deep work, and slowly building up, saying, you know, I'm going to start with a 15-minute focus session and a 30-minute focus session, then a 45-minute focus session. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a session that you're trying to get into flow. It might just be you're just trying to write. And that's going to build up your tolerance for fighting off that inner critic and everything else, because that's really the problem with that first 15 to 45 minutes, is you would be fine if you didn't have that inner critic yammering away in the back of your head, right? So that's really where that needs to come in, is just slowly building up your tolerance for listening to all of that. And once you hit a certain point, you'll start to find that you kind of slip into the flow state naturally. Another thing is that if you are basically just trying to kind of train that tolerance too, Pomodoro techniques are a great way to do it. They're not going to get you into that flow state because it is going to break it up with those 5-minute breaks, but it's an excellent way to kind of work on just focus tolerance in general.
Okay, great. There's a couple questions here about the inner critic and how to deal with it. Krishna says that their inner critic is immediately trying to correct all their grammar errors and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And then Ishika is saying, what's the role of the inner critic in terms of criticizing our own work and trying to decide if it's actually any good? So can you talk about those two sort of sides of the inner critic?
Yes. Okay. So whenever you're dealing with, basically we have to separate out whether we are in creation mode or we are in critique mode. And when we are in creation mode, we need the inner critic to be as quiet as possible, because this comes back to kind of the crappy first draft theories that everyone talks about. You just have to get this stuff out on the page first, right? So that is an example of a first draft. You are in pure creation mode. You don't need to be editing. You don't need to be thinking about any of this. You just need to get it out on the page so you can then look at it. Then you would switch gears over into critique mode, in which, yes, you need that inner critic to sit there and go, I don't like this sentence and we need to change this, or there's a plot hole here that I need to fix, or this is out of character, you know, for this certain character. And that's going to be more of an analytical activity. So that's really the key, is separate out your writing by what mode you're in. So if you are sitting here going, I just need to get this first draft out, then that's an example of you need to be in creation mode. You need to be aiming for that flow state just to get as much out onto the page as possible. Whereas if you're going, okay, I need to get this editing done, I need to take a look and kind of see where my work is going and if I like it, that's a need to be in critique mode. And that's going to be much more that analytical, logical, let's use something like a Pomodoro technique to stay focused, rather than aiming for that flow state. Because like I said, sometimes it can be a little difficult, depending on the task, of getting into the flow state with something like editing.
Yeah, but and we talk about that a lot at ProWritingAid, and that's something that I learned with my own writing as I started using the tool more, in that when you're writing your first draft, like chuck all the adverbs you want at it, fill it up with cliches, do what you need to do, use them as placeholders. And then when you go back in your analytical mode, then you can just go in and replace them and find them. But if when you're focused and in creative mode, just don't worry about any of that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Tara wants to know if you have any tips for overcoming an interruption during flow. For example, a small child or an unexpected phone call, which I have.
Okay, yes, and this is a very hard one to answer, especially because we are all in lockdown right now and probably experiencing more interruptions than usual. The main thing is to first of all try to set yourself up in an environment that you're going to have as few interruptions as possible. So that would mean if you can take and tell everyone who might be calling you, say, hey guys, I'm going to be, unreachable for the next couple of hours. If you get me on the phone, please leave me a voicemail, something like that. And then try to leave your phone outside the room, because they say don't even have it in the room because that's going to suck up your attention just being in the same room with it. It can be face down and off, and it's still a drag on your attention. Same thing is going to go for things like emails and things like that. And Cal Newport really talks a lot about getting this environmental setup for focus. But then, of course, there are going to be some interruptions that we can't help. There are emergencies and there are things that we have to take care of. And in those cases, you have to kind of realize, hey, this is a case that my flow state's going to be interrupted. I may be able to get back into it if it's something quick that I can kind of handle very, very easily. But for the most part, it's really prevention is the main goal at first, is just try to set it up so you will hopefully have as few interruptions as possible. But realize that if you do have that emergency interruption, it just kind of can't be helped. You just have to kind of try to get back into it, sit down again and go, okay, I may be starting over with my session, but let's try it again. Sometimes you may find that it's easier to get back into flow after you've had an interruption like that. Sometimes it's more difficult. It depends on what the nature of the interruption was. So I wish I had better answers other than kind of setting up your environment, but I still don't think that any of the productivity experts have really figured out what's the best way to deal with it.
Okay, fair enough. Ross wants to know, he says, would you believe that your body clock bird category is nature or nurture derived? And do you think one can shift their category from one to the other successfully?
We are finding out more and more that it does appear to be nature more than anything. Do I think that you can shift your clock to a degree? Yes, because I don't think that there's anything about us that is absolute set point. Now, does it mean that that's going to be more difficult? I would probably say so. I don't know if somebody that is having to shift their schedule is ever going to be as productive and as on the ball as somebody who is basically, dealing with a natural biological rhythm. I do think you may be able to shift it a little bit, but I'm still not sure that it's going to be something that we can ever completely overcome.
Okay. We're running out of time. I feel like I'm panicking getting through. There's 37 questions here still. So Miranda says, for those of us that write as a 9-to-5 job, how do we optimize writing during those times if we're a third bird or a night owl but can't write during the evenings? So how do you optimize it if you aren't able to be available during your peak times?
Right. And I think the point there might be to really focus on perhaps moving some of your creative tasks to that trough period. Realize that you don't need to push yourself as hard as you would as if your peak was in the evening, basically because you're going to be at such a slump in your energy levels that you're probably never going to achieve the same, like an equivalent amount of productivity at your trough period as you would at, say, your recovery period or during your peak period. But if you kind of move it to that trough period, we're still experiencing some of the same things that will help with boosting creativity. Because again, remember, when we're a little bit groggy, we're a little bit more prone to making connections and things like that. And I think the other thing that is important is really separating out your time of, again, going back to that creative versus critique mode. Kind of separating that out and saying, okay, on these tasks I need to focus on just creating versus on these tasks I need to focus on critiquing. So setting it up to where any case, probably your critique work, if you're a third bird or a lark, is going to be in the morning when you're more analytical. If you're a night owl, probably putting your critique work more towards that trough where maybe you're taking advantage of it in the very late afternoon when your peak levels might be starting to come back up.
Okay. Okay, great. There's a couple people who are asking whether these techniques are still applicable for non-neurotypical people. A couple of people asking about ADHD and autism.
You know, I actually do not have an answer on that or research data on that I can point to, but I do have the kind of advice from Srinivas, who has always said, you know, he has really suffered with his focus and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, may have ADD, if I remember correctly, but he says these techniques have worked for him. So I wish I had better research on that I could point out, hey, you know, we have studies X, Y, and Z that say, yes, we can, or maybe we need to tweak the system, you know, this way or that. But I do believe in what I have heard, these techniques can still apply.
Okay, great. So someone else is asking about the ideal time of 90 to 120 minutes per writing session, but they say they often feel restless and their attention span is smaller than that. Is this timing set in stone, or does each person need to find the time that works for them?
I would say at first you might want to experiment, and this might come back to building up your focus tolerance. You know, that's something that the more we're used to focusing intensely, basically the more used to we're getting to expanding that out over time. You may find, let's say if you're somebody that finds that you can really only focus intensely for 45 minutes, you may hit flow in the first 15 minutes and you may have a good 30 minutes that you can coast by. But let's say you're somebody that it takes you 45 minutes just to get into flow. You may be right on the edge of it, but not quite there yet. And the main point is if you feel you're falling into that category, then the focus needs to be is building up your tolerance for focusing for longer and longer. And it's just small increments. Start with 5 extra minutes at first. Don't push yourself into trying to focus for these huge chunks of time. Wherever your tolerance is at, add 5 minutes and just gradually build up. The same way that we would treat doing something like weightlifting or things like that. We wouldn't automatically go in and try to pick up something that's twice our weight if we've never lifted weights before, right? Yeah, you know, you want to start with a gradual build up, and you'll find a place where, hey, you know, hey, I've hit flow at this time and I'm consistently hitting flow whenever I say have, you know, maybe it's a 65-minute session. And what if that works for you? Fantastic. But we do want to make sure that we've got a long enough period of time to where we can find out where it takes us to get to that edge of flow, because you'll actually feel it. You'll kind of sit there and go, oh, I think I'm almost to the point where I may be able to start getting into that flow state. And if you find that, then follow after that and try to get as much time maximized out of your flow state as you can.
Okay, great. Louise wants to know if it's important to always write in the same place. She has a place where she feels comfortable and relaxed and finds it, and I assume she finds it easier to get into the flow there. Is that important?
So it actually depends on what we are looking at trying to do. Interestingly enough, we have found out through some of the neuroscience research that our creativity is boosted whenever we move to new locations. So there is something about that novelty of being in a new location that boosts our creativity significantly. However, if you are dealing with a case that you're trying to knock out a scene or something that you have, you know, imagined in depth, or you've outlined it in depth, it might be better to be in that location that you're very, very familiar with, because you also have this factor of the environment kind of acting as a trigger for your habit. And they call this environmental shaping, of whenever you sit down in a certain place and you make that habitual that that's your writing spot, then whenever you sit down in that spot, your brain is going to gear up to start writing. So we kind of have to basically kind of balance the novelty with the ability to have that habit kicking on the right, you know, neural pathways, essentially.
Okay. Great. That's interesting. That's not what I thought you were going to say. That's really interesting. We're running out of time. Okay, we'll do one more and then I think we're going to have to go. So Renelle, I hope I've pronounced that right, says food types influence my energy levels. If we're problem solving with flow states, should we be considering food?
Yes, and the reason I say that is more because your brain must have glucose to function. And this is something that not a lot of people realize, but our brain uses something like, goodness gracious, I think it is 400 calories a day, something like that. And basically your brain is only able to focus on glucose. So if, let's say, you're on a diet and you're on a very, very low carb, low sugar diet, and your blood glucose levels are totally depleted, you're going to find it very, very hard to focus. So aiming to put your focus sessions, preferably after you've had a meal that will give your brain some glucose so it can actually function, is fairly important. You want to make sure that you're not trying to do these flow sessions, you know, when you would be very, very hungry, just because your brain might not have enough glucose to basically carry out the focus for that long.
Yeah, great. I really feel like my own personal attention span really varies depending on whether or not I've had enough fuel to keep me going.
Right.
I think we're going to have to end there. In the chat, if you found this useful, please let us know. Oh, Maria, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question. We've got so many to get there. Send them to me in advance and I'll make sure that they're on the list next time. And Micah, thank you so much for this. I feel like we've all learned a ton tonight. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. And if anyone has questions they would like answered, you guys are more than welcome to submit them through the form at my website. And I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of them if we have hundreds and hundreds of questions coming in, but I will try to get to as many as I can if you weren't able to get your question answered today.
Okay, great. Micah, have a look at the chat there. There's like literally hundreds of messages from people saying that this was a great presentation and how much they enjoyed it.
Fantastic. I'm so glad everyone enjoyed it. Like I said, if you didn't get your question answered today, please submit it and I will try to answer as much as I can for everyone. Thank you all for being such a great audience.
Oh, great. And for everyone else, thank you for coming. Don't forget, tomorrow night, our next session is called Dream to Draft. And Caroline Donahue is going to show you how to go from your first idea to your first draft in 90 days. And on Thursday, we've got Kevin Tomlinson from Draft2 Digital, who is going to walk us through that self-publishing platform so that you can decide if it's the right one for you. And they're both listed on the events page, which I think was dropped. But there's a lot going on in the chat. We'll make sure we include a link to this, and all of the resources that Micah mentioned we'll include in our email tomorrow. So yeah, that's it for tonight. Thank you again for coming. Thank you again, Micah. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.